I had lived for 12,000 years, and in all that time, I had never once felt small. That changed the moment the hangar bay doors of the human vessel swallowed my shuttle whole. My name is Velcaris. I am an ambassador of the Aethan Conclave, the oldest unbroken civilization in the known galaxy. My people had charted the stars before most species in our network had learned to grow crops. We had watched empires rise and fall the way a gardener watches flowers, with mild interest and patient detachment. We did not fear new species. We welcomed them. We catalogued them. We introduced them gently to the wider universe, the way you might show a child a sky full of stars for the first time. I was not prepared for this. The approach to the human home system had already unsettled me in ways I could not immediately explain. My long-range sensors had picked up signals hours before we crossed into what the humans called their defense perimeter. I had assumed that phrase was a translation error. Young species often use dramatic language to describe modest things. A handful of monitoring satellites, perhaps. A few communication relays. The Conclave had seen it 100 times. But these were not satellites. They were enormous. My sensor officer, a meticulous Aethon named Pris, read off the preliminary measurements in a voice that grew quieter with each number, as though she were afraid of what she was saying out loud. The smallest objects in orbit above the third planet, the planet humans called Earth, were over 400 meters long. The largest exceeded 2 kilometers. There were hundreds of them just in that single orbital band, and that was one planet. "Are those space stations?" I asked. Pris studied the readings for a long moment. "They do not appear to be stationary, Ambassador. The drive signatures suggest they are fully mobile, and the material composition of their outer hulls is unlike anything in our database. Dense, layered. The sensor beam is having difficulty penetrating more than a few meters." I looked at the display screen. The objects hung in orbit like a dark forest, angular and bristling. Each one was covered in protrusions, long cylindrical extensions, clusters of shorter tubes, flat platforms with articulated arms. They did not look like instruments of science or commerce. They looked like something that had been designed very deliberately for a single purpose, and that purpose was not peaceful. I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself these were mining platforms, or construction rigs, or something I simply did not have the cultural context to understand. I requested communication contact with the human government and asked for docking permission. The response came in less than 40 seconds. The human communication officer had a calm voice and a strange accent. She said that a berth had been prepared for us and sent coordinates. The coordinates pointed to one of the largest objects in orbit. "I want you to understand something. I have visited 63 worlds in my career. I have walked into the courts of kings who claimed to be gods, and sat across the table from warlords who had burned cities. I have seen civilizations in their first fragile century, and civilizations so old, they had forgotten their own origin stories. I was not, by any reasonable definition, an easily impressed being. The moment my shuttle passed through those hangar bay doors, I was impressed. I was more than impressed. I was afraid, and I had not felt afraid in a very long time. The hangar was vast, not large in the way that old conclave structures were large. Those had a kind of open grandeur, high ceilings and wide corridors, designed to make the visitor feel elevated, welcomed, at ease. This space was large in a purely functional way, and that made it worse. Every centimeter of it was used. There were rows of smaller craft lined up in precise formation, each one about the size of my shuttle, each one with swept-back wings and hard angular shapes. There were racks of cylindrical objects along the walls, dark and sealed. There were human workers everywhere, moving with a focused, unhurried efficiency, not rushing but never stopping either. They wore dark uniforms. They did not look up when my shuttle landed. My translator identified the craft in the racks as strike fighters. It identified the cylindrical objects as torpedo storage. It translated the name painted in large white letters on the far wall as UN's Leviathan, Dreadnought class. I asked the translator what dreadnought meant. It processed for a moment, and then returned an interpretation rather than a direct translation, because the word was apparently a compound with cultural layering. It said, "A vessel so powerful that it makes the concept of fear irrelevant for those who sail it." I sat in my seat and did not move for some time after that. A human came to meet us at the shuttle ramp. She was of medium height by human standards, with short gray hair and dark eyes that moved constantly, assessing everything. She wore a uniform with more markings on it than the workers in the hangar. When I descended the ramp, she extended her right hand toward me, in the custom my briefing files had described. I took it. Her grip was firm and brief. "Ambassador Velkaris," she said. "I'm Admiral Nina Carver, United Earth Federation Navy, 7th Fleet. Welcome aboard the Leviathan." Her voice was the same calm voice I had heard over the communication channel. It occurred to me that she had personally answered my docking request. An admiral, running her own communication desk. "Admiral Carver," I said. "Thank you for receiving me." She nodded and gestured toward a corridor. "We've prepared a meeting room. If you and your staff will follow me." We walked through the ship. I tried to count the crew members we passed. I stopped trying after 3 minutes because the number was already too high to be useful. Every corridor was lit with the same steady white light. Every surface was clean and deliberately plain. There were no decorations, no art, no symbols of rank or ceremony beyond the markings on the uniforms. The Leviathan was not built to impress visitors. It was built to function, and the people inside it moved with the certainty of people who knew exactly what each part of the function was. We passed a set of open blast doors. Through them I saw a room that stretched so far back it was difficult to judge the distance. It was filled with equipment I could not immediately identify, and the smell that drifted out was sharp and metallic and slightly charged, like the air after lightning. I slowed without meaning to. "Main weapons operations," said Admiral Carver, without turning around. "Rail battery control. We won't go in there today. It's active." I did not ask what active meant in that context. I did not want to know yet. By the time we reached the meeting room, I had already begun composing the first lines of my emergency report to the High Council in my head. I had come to Earth expecting to meet a young civilization looking up at the stars with wonder in their eyes. I had instead stepped inside something that 12,000 years of Aethon history had never once produced. I did not yet know that this was only the beginning of what the humans would show me. I did not yet know that everything I believed about the galaxy, about safety, about power, about the nature of peace, was about to come apart like a ship with no armor meeting a rail battery at close range. But I am getting ahead of myself. I sat down across from Admiral Carver. She poured 2 cups of something dark and hot from a container on the table, and pushed one toward me. She did not speak first. She waited, watching me with those steady dark eyes, and I realized she was perfectly comfortable with silence. She was not nervous. She was not excited to meet me. She was simply ready, the way a very experienced person is ready, for whatever the next thing turns out to be. "Admiral," I said, "I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "How many vessels like this one does the United Earth Federation operate?" She picked up her cup and took a careful sip. "In the Dreadnought class specifically? The Leviathan and her sisters? 12. Currently deployed." She paused. "There are 8 more, in various stages of refit or construction." 12. 8 more, 20 total, of the class she called the largest. "And other classes?" I asked. She set down the cup. "Do you want the full briefing, Ambassador?" "We prepared one." "Yes," I said. "I believe I do." She turned to the screen on the wall behind her and entered a command. A fleet diagram appeared. It was, without question, the most alarming single image I had ever seen in 12,000 years of life. I looked at it for a long time without speaking. "We call that the order of battle," she said. "Current as of this morning." The numbers were on the right side of the diagram. Over 3,000 capital ships, more than 40,000 support and auxiliary vessels, strike craft numbering in the hundreds of thousands. And all of it, every single piece of it, deployed within one solar system, their own. "Admiral Carver," I said very carefully, "I need to understand something. Who were you expecting to fight?" She looked at me for a moment with an expression I would come to recognize over the following days, as the look humans made when they were trying to decide how honest to be. Then she said, "Each other." I did not respond immediately. I let the words settle. You built this fleet, I said, to fight other humans. Yes. She did not seem embarrassed. She did not offer an apology or an explanation. She simply said yes, the way you state a fact about the weather. But you are now unified, I said. The United Earth Federation. For about 200 years, yes. And in that time you did not reduce the fleet? We updated it, she said, improved it, added to it actually. Seemed like a waste to let the infrastructure go. She paused, and it turned out to be useful for other things. We've cleared 3 debris fields that were navigation hazards, assisted 2 colony establishment missions, dealt with some internal security situations. Another pause. And now here you are. I looked at the fleet diagram again. I thought about what it meant that this species had built this. Not to conquer the stars, not even knowing the stars were populated, but simply because they had not finished needing it at home. I thought about the 12,000 years of Aethan peace, the careful, proud absence of weapons in our history, the long tradition of soft power and diplomacy, and the assumption that any species advanced enough for space travel would also have learned to put down its instruments of harm. I thought about how deeply, completely wrong that assumption might be. Not about the humans, about us. Ambassador, said Admiral Carver, and her voice was still calm, still even, the way the surface of the sea is even, before something very large moves underneath it. Is there something specific you came here to discuss, or was this a general first contact visit? General, I said. For now. Understood. She pushed a small data card across the table. That's a summary of fleet positions, communication protocols, and our standard interaction agreements. Our government asked me to extend an invitation for a formal diplomatic session whenever your schedule allows. I took the card. My hand was, I noticed, not quite steady. Thank you, Admiral. She nodded and stood. I'll have someone show you and your staff to your quarters. We've got a section set aside on Deck 7. It's quiet up there. She picked up her cup again. Dinner is at 1800. Ship time, if you want to join us in the officers' mess. The cook makes a very decent curry. She said this the way she said everything, simply, without any awareness of the fact that she was standing inside a machine designed to end things, inviting me to eat curry. I said that I would be glad to join them. I lied. I was not glad. I was standing at the edge of something I did not yet have words for. But I sat down at that table at 1800 hours, and I listened, and I began to understand that the most dangerous thing about humanity was not the size of their ships or the reach of their weapons. It was the fact that they had built all of this and then put it aside, more or less, and gone on to become something you could actually have a conversation with over curry. I sent my first full report to the High Council that night. The subject line read, "Recommend immediate reclassification of Earth from Category 3 Emerging Civilization to Category Unknown." I received a reply 12 hours later. It said, "Please clarify your assessment, Ambassador. Category Unknown has not been used in over 4,000 years." I sat at my desk and thought about that for a long time. Then I wrote back, "I am aware." The morning light through the viewport of my quarters on Deck 7 was not real light. It was generated, a simulation of a sunrise, cycling through yellows and golds with a slow patience that someone had clearly put a great deal of effort into. I sat watching it and found myself thinking that this, too, was very human. To cross the void of space and still feel the need to see a sunrise. To build a weapon and then hang curtains in the bedroom. I had not slept. Not because the quarters were uncomfortable. They were thoughtfully arranged, with furniture scaled to my slightly larger frame, which meant someone had studied Aethan physiology ahead of my arrival. I had not slept, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw the fleet diagram. 3,042 capital ships. I got up and stood at the viewport, and tried to count what I could see of the orbital fleet from where I was. I stopped when I reached 30, and realized those were just the ones close enough to resolve as shapes rather than points of light. A knock came at the door. I opened it to find a young human male, in a gray working uniform, holding a tray with the morning food arrangement they called breakfast. He had a lean face, light brown hair cut very short, and the kind of steady eyes that suggested he had been doing his job long enough that delivering trays to alien ambassadors on Deck 7 did not particularly unsettle him. "Morning, Ambassador," he said. "I'm Owen. I've been assigned to your section for the duration of your visit. Whenever you need anything, you reach the corridor call panel and I'll come up." He held out the tray. "Admiral Carver asked me to mention that the briefing you requested is scheduled for 0900 in Conference Room 2, Deck 4. "Thank you, Owen," I said. I took the tray. He gave a short nod and left without ceremony, and I liked him immediately for that. No staring, no questions. Just the tray and the time and then gone. I ate without tasting the food, and spent the remaining time before the briefing reviewing what my staff had compiled overnight. My team had been busy. My senior analyst, a young Athan named Torin, had not slept either, and had produced a document running to several hundred pages that I would not have time to read before the briefing. He summarized it for me in 10 minutes in the corridor on the way to Deck 4, speaking quickly and quietly, his voice carrying the flat precision of someone delivering information they are still struggling to emotionally process. "The fleet tonnage, Ambassador," he said, "exceeds the combined naval capacity of every Conclave member civilization, including those that maintain defense forces, by a factor of approximately 8. Their propulsion systems are a different architecture from anything in our records. They appear to use a form of compressed spatial displacement that our physicists described, when I sent them the data last night, as theoretically possible but practically insane to build. Their hull materials are layered composites we cannot fully scan at distance. Their weapon systems, from what we can assess externally, are kinetic, beam-based, and explosive, with ranges and energies that make our peacekeeper cutters look like fishing boats." He paused. "I feel I should say that clearly, sir. Fishing boats." I nodded. "And the crew numbers?" "The Leviathan alone carries 6,040 personnel. Of those, roughly 4,000 are what they classify as combat-rated." He checked his notes. "The Admiral's staff tell me the crew trains for approximately 14 hours per day when on active deployment, and that this is considered standard." 14 hours per day. Every day. "Torin," I said. "Yes, Ambassador?" "When we return to the Conclave, I am going to recommend a complete restructuring of our first contact protocols." He was quiet for a moment. "Should I begin drafting the proposal, sir?" "Not yet. Let's get through the next few days first." Conference Room 2 on Deck 4 was a clean, functional room with a long table and a screen that covered the entire far wall. Admiral Carver was already there when we arrived, along with 3 of her officers. She introduced them without ceremony. "Commander Patrick Sull, my chief tactical officer," she said, gesturing to a broad-shouldered man with a close-trimmed beard. "Lieutenant Commander Grace Holton, intelligence liaison," a composed woman with light hair and quick, attentive eyes. "And Captain Andrew Fenn, engineering," a thin man with ink-stained fingers who gave me a polite nod and immediately looked back at the tablet in his hand. I introduced Torin and my 2 other staff members. The humans shook hands with each of them in turn. Then everyone sat down, and Admiral Carver began. "We thought it might be useful to give you a clearer picture of how we're organized," she said. "You've seen the numbers. I want to give you some context." She activated the wall screen. A map appeared, the Sol system in full, with every object in it marked and labeled. The fleet icons were blue. There were a very great many of them. "The United Earth Federation Navy is divided into 8 fleets," she said. 7 are assigned to system defense. The 7th is my command. The 8th is our exploration and outreach fleet. They're the ones who first confirmed your approach and flagged it to Central Command. She brought up another layer on the map. Beyond system defense, we have what we call the Rapid Response Groups. 36 of them. Each one is built around a dreadnought, 8 to 12 battleships, and appropriate support. They can be at jump-ready status in under 2 hours, and achieve maximum transit speed within 40 minutes of that. Patrick Sull took over without being asked, which told me they had done this briefing before, or rehearsed it, or both. "Transit speed," he said, "averages about 4.2 light-years per standard day for the capital ships, up to 6.8 for destroyer class. We've been working on improving that. Current projections have the new drive package getting us to 8 light-years per day within 18 months. I did the mathematics in my head. The distance from Earth to the nearest Conclave member world was approximately 60 light-years. At their current speed, a human fleet could cross that distance in just over 2 weeks. I kept my expression neutral. Torrin, beside me, did not quite manage the same. "How many worlds have you colonized?" I asked. Grace Holton answered. 14 settled colonies, 3 in early development, 7 outpost stations, 2 deep survey missions ongoing. She paused. All within about 120 light-years of Earth. "And your colony worlds," I said, "do they maintain their own fleets?" "Each colony contributes to the Federation Navy structure," said Carver. "They have local defense forces as well, but the main fleet is unified under Central Command." Unified, Central Command. 3,000 capital ships answering to a single chain of authority. I thought of the Conclave's long debates about even coordinating communication protocols between member worlds, the endless committee meetings, the careful negotiations over jurisdiction and precedence. And here were the humans, 200 years out of a global conflict that had very nearly ended them, with a unified command structure and a response time measured in hours. "Admiral," I said, "may I ask a question that might seem unusual?" "All your questions have seemed unusual," she said, and there was something in the corner of her expression that I suspected was amusement. "Go ahead." "Are you afraid of us?" I asked. The room was quiet for a moment. Sull and Holton exchanged a glance. Fenn looked up from his tablet. Carver looked at me steadily. Should we be? It was, I realized, a genuine question. Not a challenge, not a deflection. She was actually asking. "No," I said. "The Conclave poses no threat to Earth or its colonies. We have not engaged in conflict of any kind in over 4,000 years. "I know," she said. "We've been studying your transmissions for about 60 years. You've been in our neighborhood for longer than that. We just couldn't make sense of the signals until recently." She paused. "Honestly, Ambassador, we're not afraid of you. You seem like a remarkably peaceful organization." "We are," I said. "That's good," she said. "It makes things simpler." She did not need to. I understood that she was a person who had spent her career thinking about problems, and that a peaceful galactic neighbor simply meant one less problem to plan for. She seemed entirely sincere about it. That was the thing about Admiral Carver. She was never threatening. She was never aggressive. She was simply, consistently, the most prepared person in every room, in a way that made the room feel different just by her being in it. We worked through the rest of the briefing. Captain Fenn walked me through the drive architecture, or as much of it as he was cleared to share, and I found myself genuinely fascinated despite everything. Human engineering had taken a radically different path from Aethon design philosophy, where our ships were built to last, built around redundancy and sustainability, and graceful aging. Human vessels were built to perform. They were not elegant. They were precise and powerful, and they were built to do a specific job with maximum efficiency. And the job was very clearly not a gentle one. By mid-afternoon, my head was full of numbers and diagrams, and the particular quality of Admiral Carver's voice explaining things that should have terrified me, and instead left me feeling, strangely, like I was learning something I should have known a very long time ago. We broke for the day at 1600. Owen appeared at Conference Room 2's door with quiet precision, as though he had been waiting just outside, and walked us back to Deck 7. As I turned into my corridor, Torrin fell in beside me. He waited until Owen had gone. "Ambassador," he said quietly. "Yes." "I received a communication from the High Council during the afternoon session. Priority classification." I stopped walking. "What does it say?" He looked at me with an expression that was not quite alarm and not quite confusion and somewhere in between. "The Council is asking whether we should be concerned about the humans." I thought about that for a moment. About the fleet diagram. About the response times. About the drive speeds and the crew numbers. And the way Admiral Carver's officers moved around the ship like people who had learned to occupy space very efficiently, because wasted space had costs. "Tell the Council," I said slowly. That the humans have been entirely cooperative and transparent with us. That they have given us no reason for concern, and every indication of peaceful intent. Torin nodded, stylus ready. And then tell them, I said, that the humans have, in the past 200 years of unified government, deployed a standing military force of such scale that it has no parallel in our known history, built with technology we cannot fully scan and cannot replicate, crewed by people who train 14 hours a day, with a response time measured in hours, and a maximum transit speed that will continue to improve. Torin wrote all of that down. And then, I said, tell the council to take that information and decide for themselves whether they are concerned. He looked up. That seems like it will cause a significant amount of anxiety at the council level, Ambassador. Good, I said. They should understand how I spent yesterday. I went into my quarters. I looked at the simulated sunrise on the viewport, which had cycled back around again, because it was that kind of program. Peaceful, calming. Someone on the Leviathan had gone out of their way to make their alien guest feel at home. I thought about that. The same people who kept 4,000 combat-rated crew on a single ship, training 14 hours a day, had also programmed a fake sunrise so their guest would feel better in the morning. I realized, going to spend a great deal of time thinking about humans. Not just because they were powerful, not just because their fleet was unlike anything I had ever conceived of, but because they were strange in a way that I had not encountered before. In 12,000 years of meeting strange things. They were dangerous, and they were kind, and they seemed to see no contradiction in that at all. The signal came in the middle of my second night on board. I was asleep, finally, for perhaps the first time since arriving. Owen had left a thermos of something warm and slightly sweet outside my door, with a small handwritten note that said it helped with off-cycle rest, and he had been correct, and I had been grateful. And I had gone under somewhere around the ship's 2,200 hours with the fake sunset cycling past my window. The signal did not come to me first. It came to the Leviathan's communications center. But the reverberations of what happened next found me very quickly. I was woken at 0200 by Torin, who was standing in my doorway with his display tablet held tightly in both hands, and an expression on his face that I had never seen on him before. He was young, as I said. He had been with me for 3 years. In that time I had seen him handle complex negotiations, political crises, and the general low-level strangeness of the Conclave's endless internal arguments, with the steady composure of a professional who knew that most problems were not actually emergencies. He looked, standing in my doorway at 0200, like he had just looked directly at something very large and very bad coming very fast. Ambassador, he said, the Vreth Dominion has crossed the frontier. I was on my feet before he finished the sentence. The Vreth. I need to give you some context about the Vreth, because the Conclave's public position on them had always been carefully worded, and most of what I am about to say was not widely discussed outside of the senior diplomatic corps. The Vreth Dominion was an empire of approximately 40 star systems, located on what the Conclave referred to as its eastern frontier. They had been a problem, in various forms, for approximately 800 years. They were aggressive, expansionist, and organized around a command hierarchy that rewarded the acquisition of territory and resources above all else. They were not unintelligent. They were not irrational. They were simply operating under a value system that placed the acquisition of power above every other consideration, and they were good at it. The Conclave's approach to the Vreth for the past 800 years had been what our Foreign Affairs Division politely called structured deterrence. What this meant in practice was tribute. Regular shipments of rare materials, technology transfers, and territorial concessions, designed to keep the Vreth satisfied enough that the cost of attacking Conclave worlds did not seem worth the benefit. It had worked, more or less. There had been incidents. There had been periods of heightened tension, but the fundamental arrangement had held because the Vreth were calculating, and the calculation had always come out the same way. Until now. Torin handed me his tablet. The signal was from the Conclave's frontier monitoring station at Pellis 4, one of 3 early warning installations on the eastern boundary. It had been transmitted 6 hours ago. The delay was due to relay distance. The Vreth fleet had crossed the boundary at 3 points simultaneously. Not a patrol incursion, not a show of force. A full military advance. 2 Conclave member worlds, Estal and the Mirani colony at Dusk Station, had already reported contact with Vreth vessels. Estal had gone silent 40 minutes after its last transmission. I read the report twice. Then I sat down on the edge of my bunk and held the tablet in my hands and thought very carefully about what to do next. The Conclave had no warships. I need to say that plainly because it is not widely known outside of diplomatic circles, and it matters enormously here. The Conclave had peacekeeper forces, patrol cutters, inspection vessels, search and rescue ships. What we did not have, had not had in over 4,000 years, was anything built for combat. Our founding charter prohibited it. Our entire philosophical framework rested on the principle that a civilization advanced enough to join the Conclave should have moved past the need for weapons of war. We had 600 peacekeeper vessels in total, spread across more than 200 member worlds. None of them were designed to engage a Vreth warship. Some of them, in honest assessment, could barely outrun one. The Vreth fleet that had crossed the frontier, according to the last sensor sweep in Torin's report, was over 600 vessels, with more suspected in reserve. I sat in my quarters on Deck 7 of the UN's Leviathan, surrounded by the largest and most capable military force in the known galaxy, and for the first time in 12,000 years, I was not sure that my civilization was going to survive the next few months. The thought was not abstract. It was not dramatic. It was simply and horribly concrete. Estel had gone silent. I stood up. "Wake my staff," I said to Torin. "All of them. And then find Owen and ask him to take us to Admiral Carver. Immediately. Whatever time it is, whatever she is doing." Torin moved. I dressed quickly, not because clothing was urgent, but because the act of doing something, anything, was necessary. I needed to move. Standing still while Estal was silent was not something I could do. Owen was at my door in 4 minutes. He was fully dressed, completely alert, and asked no questions. He simply said this way, and led us at a quick pace through the night shift-lit corridors of the Leviathan, where even at 0200, there were crew members moving with the same focused, continuous energy I had seen at every hour since my arrival. It occurred to me that this ship probably did not truly sleep. It was simply at different levels of activity at different times. Admiral Carver met us in a small briefing room 2 decks below the bridge. She was also fully dressed. She had a cup of something in her hand. Her hair was slightly less precise than it had been during the day, but her eyes were exactly the same. She had clearly already been awake. "Ambassador," she said, "I was about to send for you." I stopped. "You already know." "Your frontier signal crossed ours by about 2 hours," she said. "Our long-range sensor net picked up the fleet movement. We've been tracking the Vreth advance since approximately 2100. She set down her cup. 3 Conclave worlds have received contact warnings. Estal and Dusk Station you already know about. A third, designated in our records as Mirani Prime, went to emergency broadcast about 90 minutes ago. 3 worlds, not 2. The situation had moved while we slept. I stood in that small room, and I felt the full weight of what I was about to do press down on me the way nothing in 12,000 years had. I was an ambassador of the oldest civilization in the known galaxy. I had come to this planet to welcome a young species into our community. I had expected to be the one doing the welcoming, the guiding, the patient and generous older hand. What I was about to do instead was ask for help. "Admiral Carver," I said, "the Aethon Conclave has no military forces capable of responding to what the Vreth Dominion has initiated. Our peacekeeper fleet cannot engage Vreth warships in direct combat. They are not designed for it." I paused. I had rehearsed this in my head during the walk to this room, and even rehearsed, it felt like swallowing something very large. I am personally authorizing, a formal diplomatic request on behalf of the Conclave High Council for military assistance from the United Earth Federation. The room was quiet. Admiral Carver looked at me for a moment, not with surprise, not with triumph or eagerness, with attention, the way she looked at everything. How many worlds are in immediate danger? She asked. As of 90 minutes ago, 3 with confirmed contact. 11 more within likely range of the advance, if the Vreth hold their current vector and speed. What are the Vreth after? Resources? Territory? Both. And the message they send when they take it. I met her eyes. Dominion means what it says, Admiral. They are not raiding, they are claiming. She nodded slowly. Then she turned to a communication panel on the wall and pressed a key. Sol, she said. A voice came back instantly, slightly rough with night shift hour but fully coherent. Admiral. Begin pre-jump sequencing for Battle Group Odin. Full activation. I want all 12 elements on the board and ready in 2 hours. A pause. Half a second. Understood. Pre-jump in 2 hours. She released the panel and turned back to me. How fast do you need us there? I thought of Estal going silent. I thought of whatever was happening on Marani Prime right now while we stood in this room. As fast as your ships can move, Admiral. She picked up her cup again. Then let's sit down and talk about what you need us to do when we get there. We sat. We talked. I told her everything the Conclave knew about the Vreth, their fleet composition, their tactics, their command hierarchy, the 3 points where they had crossed, and the likely support positions behind those crossings. She listened without interrupting, asking sharp, precise questions at exactly the moments when I had information that matched something she was already modeling in her head. Sol joined us 20 minutes in, then Holton, with intelligence overlays she had pulled together from the sensor data. Fen calmed in from engineering to report that the drive plants were already warming on 5 of the 12 battle group ships, because the engineering crew had started the sequence the moment Sol had relayed the order. They did not waste time. They did not debate. They did not hold a committee meeting, or draft a position paper, or ask to consult their legal framework for the authorization of military action outside the home system. They just started moving. At 04:15, I stepped out onto a walkway overlooking the main hangar bay. Below me, the strike craft were being moved into launch configuration, lined up in rows with a precision that should not have been possible in the dark at 4 in the morning, but clearly was, because these people had done it before. I could feel the Leviathan's engines through the walkway grating, a low, steady vibration that was gradually building in pitch. Around us, through the viewports along the hangar wall, I could see the running lights of the other battle group ships moving into formation. 11 other vessels, ranging from the sister dreadnoughts to the long dark shapes of the destroyer squadrons, assembling in the dark of Sol orbit like something being called together from a long rest. Owen appeared beside me. I had not heard him approach. "Can I get you anything, sir?" he asked. I looked at the assembling fleet. I thought about Estal, silent in the dark. I thought about 12,000 years of civilization built on the idea that peace was the natural destination of any advanced species, and I thought about how we had confused destination with distance, and how the distance had caught up with us while we were congratulating ourselves on having traveled so far. "No thank you, Owen," I said. He stood beside me for a moment, looking at the same thing I was looking at. "They'll be all right," he said. It took me a moment to understand he was talking about the people on those worlds. He had heard enough in the corridors to know the situation, and he was not trying to reassure me with data or analysis. He was simply saying it the way you say something, when you mean it, and you have some reason to believe it. "How do you know?" I asked. He nodded toward the assembling fleet outside the viewport. "Because of them," he said simply. I looked. The 12 elements of Battle Group Odin were nearly in formation now. In the light of Sol, at distance, they looked like what they were: enormous, dark, dense, bristling with the particular geometry of machines built for a single purpose. For the first time since I had arrived at Earth, I did not find that sight frightening. I found it, against all the expectations of 12,000 years, reassuring. I have stood on many bridges in my life. I have been on conclave ceremony vessels, on trade ships, on the dignified and beautifully appointed flagships of member civilizations that considered the bridge a statement of cultural identity as much as a functional space. They were large, they were often beautiful, and they were calm in the way that places are calm when the people in them have nothing urgent to do. The bridge of the Ewan's Leviathan was not beautiful. It was not large, relative to the size of the ship. It was packed with stations, each one occupied, each operator focused, and the air in it had the particular texture of a space where information was moving continuously, and every person in it was processing their share of it without pause. Admiral Carver stood near the center, not at a specific console but at a position from which she could see every other position. She had a headset looped around one ear, but not engaged. Available if she needed it, not in the way if she did not. Sol stood at the tactical board. Holton was at the intelligence station to the left. Fenn's voice came through a speaker from engineering at regular intervals with status updates that followed a precise pattern. Power levels, drive status, system readiness, all in a compressed shorthand that everyone on the bridge understood, without slowing down to parse it. I stood at a visitor rail at the rear of the bridge with Torrin beside me. We had been given access with a quiet word from Admiral Carver. "You asked what we do. Here's where we do it." Outside the main viewport, the jump had not yet happened. We were still in Sol space, the last of the formation checks completing. On the tactical display, Battle Group Odin was a formation of blue icons, tight and ordered, moving in concert. "Admiral," said the navigation officer, a young woman named Lieutenant Pryor. "All elements confirm jump ready. Formation integrity is nominal." Carver nodded. "Helm, execute jump on my mark." She paused. "Not long. Long enough to take one breath. Mark." The viewport went white. Not the white of an explosion, the white of space folding, of distance collapsing, of something that should have taken years becoming a matter of seconds. It lasted perhaps 3 heartbeats. Then the white resolved, and the stars were different, and the tactical display immediately began populating with new contacts. A great many new contacts. "Reading the Vreth fleet," said Sol, and his voice was level and professional, in a way that told me he had announced things like this before. 612 contacts in the primary engagement zone. Approximate positions matching intelligence estimates. On the far edge of the display, 3 Conclave member worlds appeared as green icons. Around 2 of them, red icons swarmed. Estel was still gray. No signal. No status. Carver studied the display for perhaps 4 seconds. "Holton," she said, "identify the Vreth command structure. Flag the command vessels." "Already flagging," said Holton. 3 identified as probable fleet commanders based on signal density and formation positioning, designating them Vreth Command 1, 2, and 3. Sol, target solution on all 3. Target solutions computed. Contact protocol? "Hailing them now," said Communications Officer, Lieutenant Dawes, a young man, very calm. Standard diplomatic band, auto-translated to Vreth, primary language. I had not expected that. I had not expected that the first thing they would do is hail the Vreth. A signal came back within 2 minutes. The Vreth commander's voice was rough and complex, a language of layered tones that my translator processed in real time. The translation appeared in text on a secondary display. It said, "Unknown vessels. You have entered a zone of active Dominion expansion. Identify yourselves and state your authorization to be present in this space, or be considered hostile." Admiral Carver read the translation. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to Dawes. "Send this," she said. "United Earth Federation Naval Battle Group Odin, responding to a humanitarian assistance request from the Aethan Conclave. The worlds you are currently engaging are members of the Conclave and are under our protection as of this moment. You are requested to cease all offensive operations immediately and withdraw your forces to your boundary. You have 30 minutes to comply." She paused and then added, "Send them our fleet composition as well. Full data. I want them to know exactly what they're looking at." I found myself holding very still. The Vreth response came in 11 minutes. It was longer than the first transmission. The translation took a moment to process, partly because some of what they said apparently required contextual interpretation. When it appeared on the display, it read, "Your stated numbers are not credible. No species in this region maintains a naval force of the scale you claim. You are bluffing. We do not negotiate with those who bluff. You have 5 minutes to clear this space, or we will treat you as a conclave auxiliary force and engage accordingly. The bridge was quiet after that. Not the quiet of uncertainty. The quiet of people who had done their jobs correctly and were now simply waiting for the next moment to arrive. And Carver looked at the display. She looked at the timer she had set, 29 minutes and counting down. She looked at the fleet composition of Battle Group Odin laid out across the tactical board, and then at the 612 Vreth contacts, and her expression did not change. "Continue count," she said. The Vreth, in those 30 minutes, did not cease operations. The red icons around the two engaged worlds continued their movement. Dawes reported 3 more transmissions from the Vreth, each more aggressive in tone than the last, each operating on the assumption that we were a bluff. At 28 minutes and 40 seconds, Carver said, "Sull." "Ready, Admiral?" "Weapons free on the flagged Vreth command vessels. Kinetic batteries. Single volley." Sull's hands moved, firing. I had braced myself for something dramatic, for noise, for shaking, for the ship to lurch. The Leviathan did not lurch. The kinetic batteries fired with a vibration that you felt more in your teeth than your feet. A deep, continuous shudder that lasted perhaps 2 seconds and then stopped. On the display, the 3 Vreth command vessels' icons disappeared. Not damaged, not crippled, gone. The tactical display updated. The Vreth fleet began to lose coherence almost immediately. The command structure had been the center of their coordination, and with 3 command vessels destroyed simultaneously, the outer formations began to separate, some pulling back, some holding position in confusion, the edges of the fleet losing the tight formation they had maintained. A new transmission from the Vreth came in 40 seconds later. Different voice, different tone. The translation read, "We are requesting ceasefire terms." Sull looked at Carver. She looked at the display. The red icons around the 2 conclave worlds had stopped moving. She looked at Estal, still gray. She looked at Marani Prime, where the icons had been dense enough that whatever had been happening there had been very bad. "Tell them ceasefire terms are straightforward," she said. "Complete withdrawal to the Vreth home systems. Any Vreth vessel beyond the conclave frontier in 30 days will be treated as an active hostile. We will conduct enforcement patrols of the frontier for the next year, and there will be a formal diplomatic session arranged through conclave channels to discuss the status of the tribute agreements they've been operating on." She paused. "Tell them also that if they'd like to know what the alternative looks like, they're welcome to decline, and I'll be happy to show them the rest of our combat capabilities. But I'd rather not waste the ammunition." The translation was sent. The response came in 6 minutes. The Vreth accepted. I stood at the visitor rail and watched the red icons on the tactical display begin their slow withdrawal, and I cannot give you a clean, simple description of what I felt in that moment, because it was not a clean, simple feeling. There was relief, overwhelming, physical relief that loosened something in my chest that had been locked tight since Torin had woken me in the dark with his tablet. There was a kind of grief for what had already been lost, for Estel silent, and whatever had happened on Mirani Prime before we arrived. And there was something else, something I did not immediately have a name for. It was awe. Honest, clean, uncomplicated awe. Not at the weapons, not at the ships. Those were impressive in a technical sense, and I had been impressed by them since the moment I entered the hangar bay 2 days ago. What I felt awe at, standing there watching the withdrawal, was the people. 6,000 of them, on this ship alone, training every day, for years, for exactly this. Not because they had been at war. They had not been at war, not with anyone outside their own system, not in the full span of the Federation's existence, but because they understood, in a way that the Conclave had forgotten or perhaps never fully understood, that peace does not maintain itself, that the space between civilizations is not safe because civilizations are peaceful. It is safe when someone makes it safe. The Conclave had outsourced that to diplomacy and tribute for 800 years, and it had worked, until it didn't, and when it stopped working, we had nothing. Nothing except the fact that 2 days ago, by chance or fate, or the slow turning of history, a young species had found us and invited us for curry, and shown us a fleet diagram that had kept me up all night. Lieutenant Pryor's voice broke through my thoughts. "Admiral, signal from Mirani Prime. They're broadcasting again." The bridge was quiet. "Put it through," said Carver. The signal was audio only, rough with interference and clearly transmitted in a hurry. A Mirani voice, speaking conclave common, shaking but coherent. The translation appeared on the secondary display in parallel with the audio. "This is Mirani Prime Emergency Communications. We are registering the withdrawal of Vreth forces from our orbital approach. We are reading unknown vessel signatures in sector. Please identify. Please identify. We have casualties. We need assistance, please." "Is anyone out there?" Carver looked at Dawes. "Get medical teams to the shuttles," she said quietly. "And patch me through to Mirani Prime." Dawes worked his board. "You're live, Admiral." She leaned toward the communication pickup. Her voice, when she spoke, was the same voice she always used. Even, calm. The voice of someone who has thought about everything that needs to happen next, and is now simply beginning to do it. "Mirani Prime. This is Admiral Nina Carver, United Earth Federation Navy. The Vreth forces have withdrawn and will not return. We are sending medical and engineering assistance now. Hold on, we're coming." I stood at the visitor rail. Torin was beside me. He was not writing anything down. He was just standing there, watching. After a moment, he said, very quietly, "Ambassador." "Yes." "I have been thinking about the report I need to write for the Council." "So have I." He was quiet for another moment. Below us, through the internal viewport that looked down into the forward section, I could see crew members moving toward the shuttle bays with the same focused, purposeful speed they brought to everything. "I am not sure," Torin said, "how to explain what I have seen to people who were not here. I thought about that. About the fleet diagram. About the simulated sunrise. About Owen saying, 'They'll be all right,' with genuine conviction, because he was surrounded by people who had made it their life's work to make that true. About the 4 seconds Admiral Carver had taken to study the tactical display before giving her first combat order. About the way the entire bridge crew had moved in those 4 seconds, each person already doing their part without waiting to be told, because they had trained for this so many times that the training and the doing had become the same thing. "Tell them the truth," I said. "All of it, even the parts that are uncomfortable. They will not believe some of it." "I know." He glanced at me. "How did we not know about this, Ambassador? We have been in this galaxy for 12,000 years. How did a species develop this level of capability in the time it takes us to complete a generational committee review, and we did not see it?" It was a good question. It was, I thought, the most important question anyone in the conclave would ask about humans for the next several centuries. "Because we were not looking," I said. "We were watching the edges of their system and seeing a young species just beginning to reach for the stars. We were not looking at what they had built in the centuries before they reached." I paused. "We look at every new species and we see them on the day we meet them. We do not ask what the days before that were like." Torin absorbed this. He looked back at the tactical display, where the red icons were still pulling back, still withdrawing, the Vreth Dominion reorganizing its ambitions under the new mathematics of what the universe contained. "What do we do now?" he asked. "We go to Mirani Prime," I said. "We help." I looked at the display, at the green icon of that world, at the signal still broadcasting. "And then we go home, and we have a very long conversation about what we have learned." The High Council chamber on the Aethon homeworld, Aelior, had been built 6,000 years ago, and had not changed substantially since. It was a wide, circular room with tiered seating, arranged around a central speaking floor. The seats carved from stone that had been old when the chamber was new. The ceiling was high and domed and painted with a mural, representing the founding of the conclave. Dozens of species gathered in harmony, under a single sky, their differences celebrated rather than erased. I had stood on this floor many times. I had delivered reports from frontier worlds and colony disputes, and the long, tedious negotiations over trade agreements and territorial recognition, and all the machinery of a civilization that had been running for millennia. I knew how the chamber sounded when it was quiet, and how the acoustics carried a voice to the farthest tier without effort. I had never stood here and felt, until now, that I was about to say something that would genuinely change everything. The council was assembled in full, 47 members, representing every major civilization in the conclave, from the oldest Aethan elders in the front row to the newest member representatives on the outer tier. They had been waiting for this report for 3 weeks, since I had transmitted the preliminary summary from aboard the Leviathan during the recovery operations at Mirani Prime. The preliminary summary had caused what I can only describe as a productive crisis. There had been emergency sessions. There had been a great deal of very rapid conversation across normally very slow diplomatic channels. There had been quiet, urgent messages to my personal communication address from council members, asking questions they were not willing to ask in open session yet. Now they were here, and I was here, and it was time. I walked to the center of the speaking floor. The chamber was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system in the walls. I did not use notes. I had thought about what I wanted to say for 3 weeks, on the journey back from Mirani Prime, in the long quiet of the ship after the recovery work was done, and the Leviathan had finally headed back toward Federation space. I had thought about it until the words had arranged themselves in the right order, and now I simply said them. I told them everything. I started with the approach to Sol, the objects in orbit that were too large and too purposeful to be anything but what they were. I told them about the hangar bay, about the name Leviathan, about what the word dreadnought meant. I told them about the fleet diagram and what the numbers meant in terms of tonnage and firepower, relative to anything in the Conclave's history. I told them about Admiral Carver, her steadiness, her precision, the way she occupied a room, the way she answered questions, the way she had poured me a cup of something dark and waited for me to speak first, with the patience of someone who was not afraid of anything in particular that day. I told them about the moment I had learned the fleet was built to fight other humans. The chamber stirred at that. Good. It should stir. I told them about the signal from the frontier, about Torin waking me in the dark, about sitting on my bunk with the tablet in my hands, and understanding that Estel had gone silent. I told them about walking to that small briefing room and standing across from Admiral Carver at 0200 in the ship's night cycle and asking for help. I told them about what it felt like to ask, how large that moment was, how it pressed on 12,000 years of identity and assumption and pride, how the Admiral had not made me repeat it or explain it, or diminish myself any further than the bare fact of saying the words. She had simply asked how fast, and then called Sol and started the sequence. I told them about the jump, about the white of space folding, about the tactical display, and 612 red contacts around 3 green icons. I told them about the 30-minute deadline, about the Vreth calling it a bluff, about the quiet on the bridge in those 30 minutes, and then about Carver saying Sol's name, and Sol's hands moving, and the brief, deep vibration of the kinetic batteries, and the 3 command vessel icons disappearing from the display. I told them about the 6 minutes it took the Vreth to accept terms. I told them about Mirani Prime's voice, shaking and desperate, saying, "Is anyone out there?" And then I told them about the answer. Mirani Prime. This is Admiral Nina Carver, United Earth Federation Navy. The Vreth forces have withdrawn and will not return. We are sending medical and engineering assistance now. Hold on. We're coming. The chamber was very still. I looked around the tiered seats. 47 faces, old and young and in between, all of them watching me with the particular attention of people who understand that what they are hearing is going to change what happens next for a very long time. I have been asked, I said, to provide a recommendation to this council regarding the formal integration of the United Earth Federation into the Conclave as a member civilization. I paused. This council has also drafted a proposed integration agreement that includes, in its current form, a set of clauses restricting the UEF's ability to deploy military assets within Conclave member space without explicit council authorization per incident, a provision requiring the UEF to submit its fleet composition data for review by a Conclave oversight committee, and a clause specifying that the UEF military's command structure must be subordinated to a Conclave Diplomatic Review Board for all operations involving Conclave member worlds. I watched the faces. Several of the council members who had proposed those clauses had the look of people who knew, hearing them read aloud in this context, that they had written them from the wrong position. I am not going to recommend acceptance of that agreement, I said. The chamber stirred again. I am going to recommend rejection of those clauses in their entirety, and renegotiation of the integration framework on terms that reflect what the UEF actually is, rather than what we assumed all new member civilizations would be. Councillor Veth of the Mirani delegation, the same world that had broadcast Is Anyone Out There in the Dark, leaned forward. Ambassador, what terms would you propose instead? Full integration, I said. Equal standing with all current members. No restrictions on fleet deployment within Conclave member space for defensive purposes. And I would further propose that we establish a formal joint defense structure. A Conclave body, with actual military capability, staffed and advised by UEF Naval Command. Murmuring. Expected. You are proposing, said Elder Councillor Assis, who was the oldest person in the room and had the deliberate calm of someone who had heard many proposals and was in no hurry, that we build a military arm for the Conclave. I am proposing, I said, that we acknowledge that we already have one. It simply belongs to someone else at the moment, and that we formalize the relationship in a way that gives us some say in how it operates, rather than standing in our own hangar bay at 0200, hoping that someone will say yes. A longer silence. I want to tell you something, I said, and my voice dropped slightly, not for effect but because what I was about to say mattered to me personally, after everything. I went to Earth expecting to be the senior party in a meeting. I expected to greet a new species the way we have always greeted new species, from a position of age and wisdom, and the authority of a civilization that has seen more and lasted longer. I expected awe. I expected deference. I expected to welcome a young civilization into the care of something larger, and older, and more experienced. I paused. What I found was a young civilization that had survived everything their history threw at them, built something extraordinary from the wreckage of their own conflicts, and then, when they discovered the rest of us, did not ask whether we were a threat. They asked whether we needed help. I let that sit for a moment. And when we did need help, they came. No committee meeting, no authorization review, no debate about jurisdiction. They just came, as fast as their ships would carry them, and when they got there, they were exactly what they had trained every day to be. Elder Councillor Assis looked at me for a long moment. You admire them, he said. It was not quite a question. Yes, I said. I do. Despite the ships, despite the weapons. Because of what they use them for, I said. Another silence. Longer this time. Councillor Veth spoke again. His voice was different from the start of the meeting. Softer, more direct. I received a private communication yesterday from the relief coordinator on Mirani Prime. She said that the first human medical team to reach the planet's surface worked for 31 consecutive hours without stopping. She said the crew members were sitting in the corridors between patients, eating field rations and going back to work. She said one of the young crew members asked her, through a translator, whether there were children among the casualties, and when she said yes, he sat with his back against the wall and was quiet for a moment, and then he got up and went back to work. The chamber was still again. I want to vote, said Councillor Veth, on the full integration proposal, without the restrictive clauses. Assis nodded slowly. As do I. The vote was not unanimous. 3 members abstained and 2 voted against, their concerns noted and recorded in the permanent archive. The rest voted yes. I stood on the speaking floor and watched the count resolve on the chamber display, and felt 12,000 years of assumption quietly and permanently rearrange themselves inside me. 3 days later, I was back in transit, this time heading to Earth for what the Council had designated a formal integration ceremony. In my personal files I had a signed copy of the new treaty, and a communication from the UEF government accepting the terms and confirming their own legislative ratification. It had taken them 9 days to ratify internally, which the conclave diplomatic staff had found astonishing. A matter of weeks for a government of billions to formally join an interstellar community that most of them had not known existed a month ago. Owen had explained it to me, the last morning aboard the Leviathan, when I had mentioned this to him while he delivered my breakfast. "We're good at deciding things fast when we need to," he said. "Usually the debate is about what we want. When it's clear what we need, we move." I had thought about that for the entire 3-day transit. On the 4th day, we entered Sol space, and I watched the Earth fleet fill the sensors again. Still vast, still extraordinary, still the same organized, purposeful density of metal and human intention that had made my translator officer go quiet on the first approach. But now it looked different to me. Not less powerful, not less serious, just different. The way anything looks different when you understand what it is. Admiral Carver met me at the same hangar bay on the same deck of the same ship. She shook my hand in the same brief, firm way. Owen was behind her, which surprised me, and when he saw my expression he gave a small nod, as if he had arranged to be there and thought it was probably the right call. "Ambassador," said Carver, "welcome back." "Thank you, Admiral," I said. "We have an agreement." "I know. I read it." She turned and gestured toward the corridor. "There's a formal ceremony scheduled for tomorrow, on the surface, but tonight the crew wanted to do something, and I said it was fine." She glanced at me. "If you're amenable." "What did they want to do?" "Dinner," she said. "The whole officer mess. Apparently word got around that the treaty went through, and the cook started on it this morning." A pause. "He made enough for a small fleet." I looked at her. She looked back at me with those steady eyes. "Admiral Carver," I said, "do you know what the Conclave's Military Advisory Committee has decided to call the new joint defense structure?" She had not been told yet. I could see that in the slight shift of her expression. "No." "Task Force Shepherd," I said. "The humans named it. When we asked why, your government told our representatives, because something has to watch the flock." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a good name," she said. I thought so too. We walked through the Leviathan together, through the corridors that I now knew well enough to navigate without Owen's guidance, past the weapons operations room and the engineering decks, and the long wall of viewports that looked out over the orbital assembly of a fleet that had no equal anywhere in the known galaxy. The ship hummed around us with its constant, purposeful life. I thought about Estal, which had eventually responded after 3 days. Damaged, struggling, but alive, the Vreth advance having been stopped before the real weight of it landed. I thought about Mirani Prime's coordinator saying that a young crew member sat against the wall for a moment, and then got back up. I thought about the 12,000 years behind me, and the unknown number of years ahead, and how much had changed in the space of a few weeks, and how it had not changed, because anything had been destroyed or conquered or ended, but because a young species had picked up their comms at 0200 and said yes before I finished asking. That night, I ate dinner in the officers' mess of the UN's Leviathan, with 63 human officers who had very recently been to war on behalf of a civilization they had only learned about a month earlier, and who treated the fact with the same matter-of-fact directness they brought to everything. The cook's curry was, as advertised, very good. After the meal, Lieutenant Grace Holton sat across from me and asked me about the founding of the conclave, and I told her the story, the real one that I had told perhaps a dozen times in my career, with all the detail that the official records left out. She listened with genuine attention, asking questions at exactly the right moments. Beside me, Torin was in conversation with Patrick Sull about the tactical mathematics of the Vreth engagement, and Sull was sketching on a napkin with the comfortable ease of a man who thought in diagrams. At one point I looked down the long table and saw Owen near the far end, in conversation with one of my junior staff members, both of them laughing at something. My staff member, a young Athan who had never been off our home world before this mission, looked more relaxed than I had seen her in the entire journey. I thought, this is what it was supposed to be. This was what the conclave was built for. 6,000 years ago when the mural was painted on the ceiling of a chamber on Aelior. Not the structures, not the treaties, not the 12,000 years of careful, proud, slightly fearful maintenance of a peace that no one ever had to work for, because there was nothing threatening it, and so no one noticed it was hollow. This. People eating at a long table and telling each other things. People who had seen terrible things that week and were still here, still talking, still curious, still interested in 12,000 years of someone else's history. People who had come as fast as their ships could carry them when the signal went out, and who were now asking about the founding stories, as though they planned to be around for the next 12,000 years, and wanted to know what had happened before they arrived. Admiral Carver sat at the head of the table. She was not the loudest person there. She was not performing anything. She was eating her food and listening to the conversation around her with the same quality of attention she brought to tactical displays and emergency briefings, which was to say, completely. At some point she caught me watching her from across the table and raised her cup very slightly in acknowledgement. I raised mine in return. I thought, we almost didn't find you. We were looking at your signals and seeing a young species just learning to stand up. And we were waiting for the right moment to introduce ourselves, and meanwhile you had been building this for 200 years, getting ready for a threat you didn't know had a name, keeping the lights on and the training schedules running and the engines warm, just in case. Just in case. I thought, what would have happened to Estal and Mirani Prime and the 11 worlds behind them if that just in case had not been there? If the humans had been what we expected, new and bright-eyed and awed, with a few communication satellites and some optimistic colony ships. If we had come to them, as I had planned to come, as the senior party in a meeting, and found them without this. I did not let myself finish that thought. It was not useful to finish it. What mattered was that they had it. What mattered was what had happened, because they had it. What mattered was the cook's curry and Torin's napkin diagrams, and the young crew member who sat against the wall for a moment, and then got back up. After dinner, walking back to my quarters on Deck 7, I passed through a corridor with a viewport that faced outward toward the dark. Saul's light was behind the ship, and from this angle, the stars were very clear and very still, the way they always look when you are far enough out that the atmosphere is not between you and them anymore. I stopped and looked at them for a while. There were a great many of them. There always are, when you take the time to look. Somewhere out there, 60 light-years away, Estal was beginning the long process of rebuilding whatever it had lost in the days before we arrived. Somewhere else, Mirani Prime was counting its people and figuring out what came next. The Vreth were making calculations, new ones, recalibrated ones, based on information they had not had a month ago. Everything was different now. Everything was different, and I had played some small part in the difference. But the truth that I understood now, standing at that viewport looking at the stars, was that the real difference had been made long before I arrived. It had been made in the shipyards and training facilities and engineering schools of a species that had looked at the distance between itself and the rest of existence and decided, without knowing what was out there, that it was going to be ready. Ready for what? For anything. For other humans, who were the greatest challenge they had faced at the time. And then, because the readiness was there and the ships were there and the people were there, for whatever came after. I had lived for 12,000 years and never once felt small, until the day I flew into a hangar bay and saw what the word dreadnought meant. But standing at that viewport on the last night before the formal ceremony, what I felt was not smallness. It was something older and larger than smallness, something that the mural on the ceiling at Aelior had been trying to say for 6,000 years without anyone quite hearing it. It was gratitude. The stars were out there, and we were not alone in them, and the ones who had come to stand beside us had come prepared, and that made all the difference. The ceremony was beautiful, as ceremonies go. There were speeches and documents and symbolic gestures that I had participated in before with other new member civilizations, but which felt different this time for reasons I did not try to explain out loud. Admiral Carver stood in her full dress uniform beside the UEF Secretary General, a calm man named Patrick Gray who shook my hand with the same brief, firm grip his admiral had used 2 weeks earlier. And I thought, it must be a cultural thing, that grip. Deliberate. Unafraid. Here I am, it says. I'm not worried about you. Are you worried about me? Good. Then we understand each other. As I signed the treaty, the real one, the one without the clauses, I looked up and saw, through the wide windows of the ceremony hall, the fleet in orbit, still there, still keeping watch. They had named the Joint Force Task Force Shepherd. Somewhere in the planning sessions I had missed, a UEF officer had also given the permanent fleet assigned to conclave space a more informal designation. It was not official. It was the kind of thing that happened in military organizations below the level of official policy, but someone had painted it on the hull of the first destroyer assigned to the conclave patrol route. Owen had told me about it the morning of the ceremony, handing me my breakfast with the quiet efficiency that had become something I would genuinely miss. What does it say? I had asked. Doesn't sleep, he said. That's the whole thing. Just 2 words on the hull. Doesn't sleep. I had thought about that for the rest of the morning. Doesn't sleep. The same fleet that programmed a sunrise for their alien guest. The same crew that sat against walls between patients and got back up. The same admiral who poured the first cup and waited for me to speak and asked, "How fast?" before she asked anything else. They didn't sleep. Not because they were afraid.